Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today we're pulling the curtain back on one of the most meticulously engineered atrocities in modern history, an event shrouded in the fog of colonial bookkeeping and deliberate misdirection. We're talking about the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a business plan. The true history they don't want you to know is that this wasn't an act of God. It was an act of corporate policy. Now, I'll be blunt. This is a deeply unsettling and complex story. It's a labyrinth of corrupted ledgers, political assassinations disguised as treaties, and the cold, hard math of human suffering. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and double crosses, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right. Dim the lights. This one gets messy. To understand the crime, you first have to understand the prize. You have to erase the images the British Empire spent 2 centuries carefully cultivating. Images of a backward, impoverished, chaotic India in desperate need of salvation. That narrative is the cover story. The reality, in the middle of the 18th century, was precisely the opposite. The place we're talking about, the Bengal Suba, encompassing modern-day Bangladesh, West Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, wasn't just a province. It was arguably the economic engine of the entire Mughal Empire. It was known, without exaggeration, as the paradise of the nations. And for a fledgling British corporation with ambitions far exceeding its charter, it was the ultimate target. Bengal's wealth wasn't just a matter of gold hoarded in a Maharaja's palace. It was dynamic, productive, and integrated into the global economy on its own terms. Its textile industry was legendary. Bengali weavers produced silks and muslins of such incredible quality and fineness that they were sought after from the imperial courts of Delhi to the salons of Paris and London. And this wasn't cottage industry. It was a vast, sophisticated network of production and trade that made European cloth look coarse and clumsy by comparison. So much silver and gold flowed into Bengal to pay for these goods that it caused currency crises in Europe. Think about that. A single Indian province was acting as a global economic vacuum, pulling in the hard currency of Western empires who had little to offer in return that the Bengalis actually wanted. The land itself was unnaturally fertile, a gift of the Ganges Delta. It produced vast surpluses of rice, sugar, and other agricultural goods, supporting a population density that was remarkable for the era. The standard of living for the average Bengali peasant, by multiple contemporary accounts, was significantly higher than that of their counterpart in Britain. This wasn't a land of perpetual struggle. It was a society with deep reserves, both agriculturally and financially. It was governed by a sophisticated administration under the Nawabs, who, while nominally loyal to the distant Mughal emperor in Delhi, ruled Bengal as a practically independent state. They oversaw a complex system of tax collection, public works, and a powerful banking class, personified by the House of Jagat Seth, financiers so wealthy they could bankroll armies and whose treasury was said to be the envy of the Bank of England. Into this world of immense, self-sufficient wealth sailed the traders of the British East India Company, and it's critical to understand what the company was. It wasn't the British government. It was a private, joint stock corporation, headquartered on Leadenhall Street in London, with its own private army, its own navy, and a royal charter granting it a monopoly on trade. Its primary, its only legal obligation, was to generate profit for its shareholders. They arrived in Bengal not as rulers, but as merchants, petitioners asking the Nawab for permission to build trading posts, known as factories. They were one of several European companies, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, all vying for a piece of the action. For decades, they operated on the periphery, playing by the Nawab's rules, traders in a land of unimaginable plenty. But behind the veneer of commerce, a different calculus was taking shape in the minds of the company men on the ground. Here's a glimpse into that mindset, from an internal letter, a copy of which was conveniently lost in a fire, attributed to a senior company factor in Calcutta, circa 1750. Uncomfortable quote. We are repeatedly admonished by London to increase the dividend. They speak of trade, of negotiation, of securing better terms for our calicos and saltpeter. They do not see what we see. Bengal is not a trading partner. It is a prize. The Nawab sits atop a mountain of revenue so vast it could solve the company's debts and enrich England for a century. To continue haggling over textiles like common peddlers is not just a failure of imagination. It is an abdication of our destiny. We are not here to trade with this kingdom. We are here to acquire it. There it is. The mask slips. The language shifts from commerce to conquest. The men on the ground, witnessing the scale of Bengal's wealth firsthand, saw the absurdity of their official mission. Why trade for scraps when you could take the entire source? They weren't just traders. They were corporate scouts performing due diligence on the largest hostile takeover in world history. They saw the intricate politics of the Nawab's court, the rivalries, the ambitious generals, the powerful bankers, and they didn't see a society to respect. They saw a series of levers to pull, vulnerabilities to exploit. They saw a system whose own complexity could be turned against itself. And this is the first, most crucial, uncomfortable reality we have to confront. The famine to come was not born in the drought of 1769. It was born in the minds of men who looked upon one of the richest places on earth and saw it not as a civilization, but as an asset on a balance sheet waiting to be stripped. The prosperity of Bengal wasn't its shield. It was the scent of blood in the water that drew the sharks in. It was a fatal vulnerability because the wealth it produced created an incentive for its own destruction so powerful that it would eventually rewrite the rules of global power and plunge millions into an abyss, all for the sake of a quarterly earnings report. The asset had been identified. The valuation was complete. The next phase of any corporate takeover is, of course, the acquisition. And in the ruthless marketplace of the 18th century, the preferred method for the East India Company was not negotiation. It was a leveraged buyout executed with gunpowder and treason. The official histories call this the Battle of Plassey. But to call it a battle is to dignify it, to grant it the status of a legitimate military contest. It was nothing of the sort. It was a meticulously planned corporate coup, and its success hinged not on bravery in the field, but on duplicity in the shadows. The obstacle, the CEO of the target entity who refused to sell, was the young Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. He had ascended to the throne in 1756, and unlike his predecessors, he saw the British East India Company not as a tenant, but as a metastasizing threat to his sovereignty. Siraj-ud-Dowlah had the audacity to demand that a foreign corporation operating in his territory abide by his laws. The company was illegally building fortifications around its base in Calcutta, refusing to pay agreed-upon taxes, and giving sanctuary to fugitives from Bengali law. They were acting less like merchants and more like a state within his state. The Nawab demanded they stop. The company refused. So Siraj-ud-Dowlah did what any sovereign ruler would do. He marched his army on Calcutta and captured it. This led to the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta incident, an event that became the cornerstone of the company's justification for war. The story, as told by the company, was that the Nawab's men forced 146 British prisoners into a tiny dungeon overnight, with only 23 surviving. It was a tale of Oriental barbarism that played perfectly to the prejudices of London society and Parliament. The truth? Almost certainly propaganda, inflated for maximum effect. The number of prisoners was likely far smaller, and the deaths, while tragic, were likely the result of incompetence by a local commander, not a direct order from the Nawab. But the facts were irrelevant. The company had its casus belli. It had the public relations pretext it needed to remove a hostile leader and install someone more compliant. The board in London sanctioned a military response, and the man they chose to lead it was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clive. Clive was the embodiment of the company's new ethos: ambitious, utterly ruthless, and possessing a profound understanding that in India, fortunes and kingdoms could be bought and sold just like any other commodity. He wasn't just a soldier. He was the company's most effective and amoral corporate raider. Clive understood that a direct military confrontation with the Nawab's massive army, numbering some 50,000 men, was a fool's errand for his own small force of around 3,000. The key was not to defeat the army, but to buy its commander. Clive's real battlefield was not the plains of Plassey, but the secret meetings held in conspirators' tents. He identified a fatal weakness in the Nawab's administration, his commander-in-chief, Mir Jafar. Ambitious, resentful, and feeling sidelined by the young Nawab, Mir Jafar was the perfect mole. Through a network of agents, Clive, with the crucial financial backing of the Jagat Seth bankers, who felt their own influence waning under Siraj, entered into a secret treaty. The terms were simple and brutal. Mir Jafar would betray his nephew, the Nawab, on the battlefield. In exchange, the company would make him the new Nawab of Bengal. And for this service, Mir Jafar would deliver the Bengali treasury into the company's hands. This wasn't war. This was insider trading with a kingdom as the stock. Here is Clive in a private dispatch to a trusted associate in London, laying out the true nature of the operation. Classified memo. The gentlemen of the board speak of martial glory and the honor of the British name. Let us be plain amongst ourselves. Honor will not pay the dividend. The coming engagement is not a matter of tactics, but of transaction. I have secured the principal asset, Mir Jafar, for a price. The field of Plassey will not be a battlefield, but a stage upon which a transfer of power, already agreed upon, will be publicly ratified. My soldiers are not an army of conquest. They are the armed auditors, present only to ensure the contract is honored and the payment is made in full. On June 23, 1757, the two armies met at Plassey. The Nawab's forces vastly outnumbered Clive's, but a significant portion of that army, the divisions under the command of Mir Jafar, had no intention of fighting. They stood motionless. The battle began, and a sudden torrential downpour soaked the battlefield. The Nawab's army, unprepared, found its gunpowder drenched and useless. Clive's troops, employing the simple wisdom of covering their powder with tarpaulins, kept theirs dry. But even this stroke of luck was secondary. The decisive moment came when Mir Jafar gave the signal. He and his co-conspirators withdrew their forces from the field, and in some cases turned their weapons on the loyalist portions of the Nawab's army. The heart of the Bengali force simply melted away without a fight. Seeing the betrayal, Siraj-ud-Dawla fled, was later captured and was unceremoniously executed. The battle, which would be mythologized as a heroic triumph of British discipline against overwhelming odds, was over in hours. Fewer than 24 of Clive's men were killed. The aftermath was exactly as the classified memo predicted: an audit. Clive marched on the capital, Murshidabad, installed his puppet, Mir Jafar, on the throne, and proceeded to systematically empty the state treasury. An estimated $2.5 million, a staggering sum worth billions today, was loaded onto over 100 boats and rowed downriver to the company's headquarters in Calcutta. Robert Clive's personal share made him one of the richest men in the world. The company's debts were erased overnight. Its shareholders were ecstatic. This is the uncomfortable reality of Plassey. It wasn't a military victory, it was a crime. It established the blueprint for British conquest in India. It was a model of corporate imperialism that would be refined and repeated for the next century. Identify a target state rich in resources, exploit internal political divisions, bribe a traitor to betray his country, use a small, efficient private army to legitimize the coup, install a puppet ruler, and then plunder the state's wealth under the guise of compensation and treaties. The East India Company was no longer just a trading firm. It was now the kingmaker of Bengal, a parasitic entity fused to a host, ready to begin the long, slow, and incredibly profitable process of bleeding it dry. The installation of a puppet is not the end of a takeover. It is the beginning of the asset stripping phase. After Plassey in 1757, the East India Company, with Mir Jafar on the throne, began a frantic and chaotic plunder of Bengal. The demands for gifts, reparations, and trade concessions were endless. The company's officials engaged in private looting on a scale that was breathtaking in its audacity. They bled Mir Jafar's treasury dry, and when he could no longer pay, they deposed him and installed his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, in his place. But a puppet, even one you create, can develop a mind of its own. Mir Qasim, unlike his predecessor, was a competent and proud ruler. He tried to reform his administration and army to stand up to the company's incessant demands. He attempted to put his own house in order, to stop the hemorrhaging of his kingdom's wealth. He even tried to level the playing field by abolishing the special tax exemptions the company had granted itself, which were crippling local Bengali merchants. For the East India Company, this was unacceptable. A puppet that thinks for itself is no puppet at all. This assertion of sovereignty, however mild, was a breach of contract. The result was war. In 1764, at the Battle of Buxar, the company's private army faced a formidable alliance. The deposed Mir Qasim, the powerful Nawab of Awadh, and the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II. This was not placé. There was no widespread betrayal, no conspiracy that decided the outcome before a shot was fired. This was a true test of military strength. On one side stood the remnants of the Mughal imperial order, on the other, a private corporation's army. The company's forces, though outnumbered, were better trained, better disciplined, and better led. They won a victory so decisive, so absolute, that it sent a shockwave across the subcontinent. The Emperor of Mughal India was now, for all practical purposes, a hostage of a British trading company. This victory presented the company with a dilemma. They now had the undisputed military power to rule Bengal directly. But open conquest was messy. It would attract the attention and scrutiny of the British Parliament in London. It would mean taking on the actual responsibilities of governance, justice, infrastructure, the welfare of the population, all of which were expensive distractions from the core business of making money. Robert Clive, now ennobled as Lord Clive and sent back to India to consolidate the company's gains, understood this perfectly. He devised a solution of diabolical genius, one that would give the company all the rewards of empire with none of the responsibilities. He didn't depose the emperor. Instead, he propped him up, sat him on a makeshift throne in a tent in Allahabad, and had him perform one final tragic act of imperial authority. On August 12, 1765, Emperor Shah Alam II, a ruler with an empire in name only, signed a document. This document, known as the Grant of Diwani, is one of the most significant and cynical legal instruments in the history of colonialism. On its face, it seemed like a dry administrative rearrangement. The emperor, as the sovereign of India, granted the East India Company the right to be his Diwan, his official revenue collector. For the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the company would now collect all the taxes from the land. In return, they would send a fixed annual tribute of 2.6 million rupees to the emperor and provide 5.3 million rupees to the Nawab in Murshidabad to cover the expenses of the Nizamat, which was the administration of civil and criminal justice. Every single rupee collected beyond those two figures, the vast immense surplus from the richest province in India, would belong, legally and irrevocably, to the East India Company. Consider the sublime treachery of this arrangement. Here's a private foreign corporation, legally empowered by a captive emperor to collect the entire tax revenue of a nation for its own profit. Here is Clive explaining the perverse beauty of his creation in a letter to the company's board of directors. Uncomfortable. Quote, "To be sovereign in name is to be burdened. The crown would have us answer for famines, for justice, for the maintenance of roads and the contentment of the peasantry. Such duties are the ruin of profit. Under the terms of the Diwani, we avoid this trap entirely. The Nawab will continue to hold his courts and dispense a justice he cannot afford to enforce. The people will continue to see a familiar authority, a fiction we are happy to maintain. We have secured the kernel of power, which is the revenue, and left the husk of responsibility in the hands of the Nawab. We are the collectors, not the rulers. Let the world see a Mughal official and a Bengali prince. We shall see the ledger, and the ledger will be balanced entirely in our favor." This was the masterstroke. It created a system of dual government where the company held the power of the purse, the Diwani, and the Nawab held the empty shell of judicial and civil authority, the Nizamat. The traditional link between a government and its people, the implicit social contract where the people pay taxes in exchange for protection and services, was deliberately and surgically severed. The company had one function and one function only: to maximize revenue collection. The welfare of the 30 million people who lived in Bengal was, by the very structure of the Diwani, not their department. It was a perfect, frictionless machine for extraction, cloaked in the legitimacy of an imperial decree from a powerless emperor. The grant of Diwani was the legal instrument that made the coming famine not only possible, but inevitable. It turned the governance of a civilization into a bookkeeping exercise. The complex, organic society of Bengal was flattened into a single line item on a corporate balance sheet: revenue. And the company, now armed with a legal mandate and a private army, would proceed to collect on that revenue with a ruthlessness that defied all historical precedent, regardless of drought, regardless of flood, and regardless of the human cost. This piece of paper, signed in a tent, was not a treaty. It was the starting gun for a decade of systematic, legalized plunder that would lead directly to millions of skeletons scattered across the once fertile plains of Bengal. With the Diwani secured, the East India Company became the de facto financial master of Bengal. But it was a master that preferred to remain in the shadows. Direct rule was still too visible, too costly, too much of a responsibility. So began the era of the infamous dual government, a political construction so cynical and deliberately opaque that it remains a masterclass in institutionalized theft. On paper, the system looked plausible. The Nawab, residing in Murshidabad, would continue to handle policing and judicial matters. The company, operating from its headquarters in Calcutta, would handle revenue collection. It was presented as a neat division of labor. But this was a lie. It was a carefully constructed fiction designed for a single purpose: to enable maximum plunder with zero accountability. The Nawab had the responsibility to govern, but the company had seized all the money he needed to do so. It was a government with a ghost in the machine, and that ghost was the East India Company, siphoning off the state's very lifeblood. The company's first move was to outsource the dirty work. Instead of deploying its own British officers as tax collectors across the vast and complex countryside, a move that would have been expensive and politically explosive, they appointed 2 Indian deputies, or Naib Diwans, Mohammad Reza Khan for Bengal and Raja Shitab Rai for Bihar. These men, locals who understood the intricacies of the existing system, were now tasked with collecting the revenue on behalf of the company. They were the public face of the new administration, the buffer between the company and the people. But they were operating on a very short leash. Their orders came directly from the Select Committee in Calcutta, a small cabal of senior company officials headed by the governor. And that committee had only one instruction: increase the revenue. This is where the system's predatory nature becomes undeniable. The company's servants in Calcutta knew next to nothing about Bengali agriculture, seasonal variations, or the traditional tax codes that had been designed with a degree of flexibility to account for good and bad harvests. They operated from a position of profound ignorance, armed only with ledgers and an insatiable corporate greed. They scoured the old Mughal records, found the highest amount of revenue ever collected in the most prosperous year imaginable, and declared that to be the new, non-negotiable annual target. In some years, they simply increased the previous year's collection by a flat percentage. There was no survey, no assessment, just a number dictated from a boardroom in Calcutta. To meet these fantastical targets, Reza Khan and Shitab Rai revived and supercharged the worst aspects of the late Mughal system. They dismissed many of the traditional hereditary tax collectors, the zamindars, who often had a long-term, sometimes even paternalistic connection to the lands they administered. In their place, they instituted a system of auctioning off the right to collect taxes in a district to the highest bidder. These new tax farmers, called amils, were ruthless entrepreneurs. To win the auction, they had to promise the government an enormous sum. To make their own profit, they had to extract that sum plus their own margin from the peasantry. This unleashed a plague of extortion upon the countryside. The amil had no connection to the land and no incentive for its long-term health. His contract was for 1 year. His only goal was to squeeze the district for every last anna before he was replaced by an even more desperate bidder the following year. And here lies the genius of the accountability trap. Imagine a village driven to ruin by an amil. The villagers appeal to the Nawab's court, but the court has no power over the company's revenue collection. The amil answers only to the Naib Diwan, Reza Khan. Reza Khan, if questioned, would produce his orders from the Select Committee in Calcutta, proving he was merely meeting his quota. The British officials in Calcutta would claim they were simply administering the Diwani, a legal right granted to them by the Mughal emperor, and that the methods of collection were handled by their trusted Indian deputies. The directors in London, thousands of miles away, would see only a chart showing rising revenues and would send letters congratulating their Calcutta office on its remarkable efficiency. It was a perfect closed loop of plausible deniability. Every link in the chain could claim to be just following orders. The system was designed to have no conscience. This structure is laid bare in a typical internal directive sent from the Calcutta Council to the newly appointed British supervisors who were placed in the districts in 1769, supposedly to oversee the collection process. Classified memo. You are to understand that your primary function is observation, not interference. The collection of the revenue is to remain in the hands of the Naib Diwan's agents. You will report upon the state of the district, the condition of the people, and the particulars of their manufactures. However, you will make it clear to the Emil that the company expects the stipulated sum to be delivered on schedule and in full. Any petition of hardship from the peasantry should be recorded for our review, but you are not, under any circumstances, to authorize a remission of revenue. The company's investment is paramount. Maintain the appearance of oversight, but do not obstruct the flow of capital. Do not obstruct the flow of capital. This was the prime directive. The entire state apparatus was reconfigured into a giant hydraulic machine designed to pump wealth from the soil of Bengal into the company's ships. The dual government was, in reality, a shadow government. The visible part, the Nawab and his courts, was a powerless facade. The real government was a small group of company men in Calcutta who ruled via spreadsheets and revenue targets, insulated from the human consequences of their decrees by a labyrinthine bureaucracy of deputies and contractors. This system didn't just create poverty, it created a moral vacuum. It atomized responsibility so effectively that millions could be beggared and starved, and no single person could be held accountable. They were building a famine, brick by bureaucratic brick, and the beauty of it was it didn't even feel like killing. It just felt like good business. The creation of an unaccountable, predatory bureaucracy was only the first part of the strategy. A machine designed to extract wealth is inefficient if it's hindered by safety features. And the traditional Bengali society, like most advanced agricultural civilizations, had centuries of built-in safety features designed to mitigate the recurring threat of famine. These were not sentimental acts of charity. They were essential mechanisms of statecraft, born from the hard-won knowledge that a dead peasant pays no taxes. The long-term stability of the kingdom depended on the survival of its people. To the East India Company, however, long-term stability was an abstraction. The only thing that mattered was the short-term dividend. And so, with the cold logic of a modern-day corporate downsizer, the company began to systematically identify and dismantle every one of Bengal's traditional defenses against starvation, deeming them to be unacceptable costs on the balance sheet. For centuries, the rulers of Bengal had maintained a system of public granaries. In years of bountiful harvest, the state would purchase surplus grain at a fair price and store it. When the monsoons failed or floods came, these reserves would be opened, and the grain distributed or sold at heavily subsidized prices to avert starvation. This was the society's insurance policy against the caprices of nature. For the company, however, this system was an absurdity. A granary full of grain was, in their eyes, capital sitting idle. It was a non-performing asset. Why let thousands of tons of rice sit in a warehouse when it could be sold immediately on the open market for a profit? The maintenance of the granaries was a recurring expense, the guards a drain on the payroll. The entire concept was antithetical to their model of immediate, maximized returns. So the granaries were emptied, the purchasing program stopped, and the buildings themselves were left to fall into ruin. The second line of defense was a flexible tax code. The Mughal system, while often exacting, had provisions for hardship. In a year of drought, it was understood that revenue demands would be lessened. Takavi loans, or advances of money and seed from the state, were given to farmers to help them survive and plant for the next season. Tax remissions were common. This was not benevolence, it was pragmatism. An administration that drives its farmers into utter ruin destroys its own tax base for years to come. But to the company's new administrators in Calcutta, this flexibility was simply an excuse for inefficiency and corruption. Their mandate from London was not to sustain the peasantry, but to increase remittances. The new policy was rigid. The stipulated revenue was to be collected in full, in cash by the deadline regardless of the harvest. A drought was not a reason for remission. It was a problem for the farmer to solve. Finally, there was the decentralized social structure itself. The traditional zamindars, for all their flaws, were tied to the land. Their own wealth and status depended on the continued productivity of their estates. Many maintained their own local storehouses, provided loans to their tenants, and had a vested interest in keeping their workforce alive through a crisis. But as we've seen, the company AS' new system of auctioning off tax collection rights to the highest bidder was systematically destroying this class. The new Amils had no such connection to the land. They were temporary contractors. Their sole incentive was to extract the maximum amount of wealth in the shortest possible time. They were not stewards. They were locusts. This ideological shift is perfectly captured in an internal policy review memorandum, attributed to Richard Becker, the company's resident at the Nawab's court, circulated in 1768. Uncomfortable. Quote, "We must disabuse ourselves of the paternalistic notions that have guided native administration. The maintenance of public granaries and the arbitrary remission of taxes represent a gross misallocation of capital and create a culture of dependency. A properly regulated market, governed by the natural laws of supply and demand, is the only rational and efficient distributor of resources. In times of scarcity, rising prices will incentivize merchants to bring grain from areas of surplus. State intervention in this process is not only costly to the company's revenue, but is ultimately a detriment to the establishment of a robust and self-regulating economy. Our objective is to collect revenue, not to engage in state-sponsored charity." State-sponsored charity. That is how they viewed a centuries-old system of famine prevention. The language is chillingly modern. It's the sterile, detached language of a consultant's report recommending layoffs. They were applying abstract, untested European economic theories to a complex, ancient society they barely understood. And the properly regulated market they spoke of was a fantasy. In reality, it was a market they were in the process of rigging. A market where the company itself was becoming the largest and most predatory player. By destroying the old systems, they weren't creating a free market. They were creating a vacuum they intended to fill. And so the stage was set. The firewalls were down. The society's immune system had been deliberately suppressed. The company had created a new, brittle system of pure extraction, removing every element of resilience, every buffer that could absorb a shock. They had turned a resilient, intricate ecosystem into a monoculture, fragile and vulnerable. They had, in effect, removed all the safety nets and shock absorbers from a complex machine, and were now running it at the highest possible speed to see how much power it could generate before it inevitably flew apart. The people of Bengal were now living without an insurance policy, for the first time in their history. When the next drought came, there would be no public granaries. There would be no tax relief. There would be nothing standing between the peasant and the abyss. This was not an accident. It was the plan. Awaiting continuity, with the old social safety nets dismantled, the company's revenue machine could now operate without impediment. And at the heart of this machine was a new, brutal tax system, an engine of extraction so efficient and unforgiving that it would make the most rapacious of the old Nawabs seem benevolent by comparison. It wasn't just that the company was demanding more money, though it was on a scale that shattered all historical precedent. It was that they fundamentally re-engineered the very nature of how a peasant interacted with the state, transforming a reciprocal, if unequal, relationship into a purely transactional one, where the peasant was no longer a subject to be governed but a resource to be liquidated. The key to this transformation, the master switch that electrified the entire system for maximum pain, was a single, devastating policy decision: the insistence that all taxes be paid in cash. Under the Mughal system, and for centuries prior, a large portion of land revenue was paid in kind. The farmer would give the state a share of his actual crop, a percentage of the rice, the wheat, the lentils he had just harvested. This system had a built-in automatic shock absorber. If the monsoon failed and your harvest was only half the usual amount, your tax payment was also halved. It was a system rooted in the physical reality of the land. The company saw this as archaic and inefficient. Their shareholders in London couldn't be paid in bales of rice. They dealt in pounds sterling, and so the company demanded its revenue in the universal equivalent, silver coin. This seemingly simple administrative change had catastrophic consequences. It forced every farmer in Bengal into the monetized economy on the company's terms. To get the silver coins to pay the taxman, a farmer now had to sell a portion of his crop on the open market. But since every farmer had to do this at the same time, immediately after the harvest when the tax collector was at the door, the market was flooded with grain. This massive, predictable surge in supply caused the price of grain to plummet. So the farmer had to sell more and more of his crop just to get the same amount of cash to meet the tax demand. The system was designed to make him run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. And what happened if the harvest was poor? Or if the farmer couldn't sell his grain in time? He had one option: the moneylender. A new class of financiers and grain merchants, often working in direct collusion with the company, Sona Meals, flourished under this system. They would provide the desperate farmer with the cash to pay his taxes, but at an astronomical rate of interest. The collateral for the loan was the farmer's land, his tools, his livestock, and often his next year's harvest. This created a perfect and inescapable debt trap. One bad season, one family illness was enough to push a farmer into a cycle of debt from which he could never escape, effectively becoming a bonded laborer on the very land his family had worked for generations. On top of this crippling new mechanism, the sheer quantum of the demand was crushing. Official company records, though sanitized, tell a clear story. In the final stable year of Mughal administration, the total land revenue collected from Bengal was around £800,000 sterling. In 1765, the first year of the Diwani, the company collected £1.47 million. By 1768, just before the famine, that figure had ballooned to over $2 million. They had more than doubled the tax burden of the province in 3 years, and this revenue was enforced with a violence that old-timers could not recall. The Amils, to meet their impossible quotas and secure their own profits, employed thugs and collectors who used flogging, torture, and the public degradation of defaulters as standard operating procedure. A junior company official stationed in a rural district as a supervisor wrote this in his private journal, a record that was never intended to see the light of day. Classified memo. The cries from the villages are becoming a constant background noise to our work. The Amil in my district is a man named Kamaluddin, who bids for the revenue and then collects it with the aid of a dozen ruffians armed with sticks. I have seen a man flogged unconscious for a shortfall of a few rupees. Last week, they seized a family's only 2 oxen because their crop had failed. When the man protested, they told him to sell his children. My official duty is to report on crop yields and market prices. I send my dispatches to Calcutta, written in the neat, passionless language of commerce. Privately, I cannot shake the feeling that we are not a government. We are the receivers in a bankruptcy, and we have been ordered to strip the house bare before the corpse is even cold. This system was the trigger mechanism for the apocalypse. It created a population living on a razor's edge, with no savings, no stored grain, and deep in debt, even in years of relative plenty. The intricate social fabric of the countryside was being shredded and replaced with a brutal cash nexus. The revenue machine was perfectly calibrated. It didn't just extract the surplus, it extracted the means of survival. It took the seed grain for the next planting. It took the bullocks needed to plow the fields. It took the very resilience of the people and converted it into silver, which was then shipped to London. The machine had no emergency brake. It could not slow down. Its only function was to accelerate, grinding forward relentlessly, consuming everything in its path. And it was pointed directly at the year 1769. The revenue machine, demanding its tribute in silver, created a desperate and captive population. But the East India Company was not content to simply collect cash. It was, after all, a trading corporation at its core, with global ambitions and complex logistical challenges. One of the most significant of these was the China trade. Britain had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, but the Chinese had little interest in British goods. They demanded payment in silver, leading to a massive and unsustainable outflow of hard currency from Britain to China. The company needed a product that China would buy, something to reverse this silver drain. They found their solution growing in the fertile soil of Bengal: opium. The plan was as simple as it was destructive. They would use their newfound administrative control over Bengal to force the cultivation of opium, ship it illegally to China, and use the drug money to buy tea for London. To balance their books, they would unbalance an entire society. This strategic imperative led to the next phase in the subjugation of the Bengali farmer. It wasn't enough to demand cash taxes. The company would now dictate exactly how the farmer was to earn that cash. This was accomplished through a system of forced cultivation, primarily of opium and indigo, a plant that produced a valuable blue dye. The mechanism was the Dadani or advance system. It was a masterpiece of coercive economics. A company agent, often with armed guards, would arrive in a village and identify the best lands that were traditionally used for growing rice. He would then approach the farmers and compel them to accept a cash advance, a pitifully small sum, as prepayment for a future crop of opium or indigo. This was not an offer. It was a command. To refuse the advance was to invite violence and the wrath of the company. Once a farmer accepted the cash, he was trapped. He was now legally indebted to the company and contractually obligated to plant his best fields with the specified cash crop. He was forbidden from using that land to grow rice or anything else to feed his own family. The price for the final crop was fixed by the company at a rate far below what it would fetch on a free market, ensuring the farmer could never get ahead. If his opium crop failed due to weather or blight, he was not released from his obligation. The advance was treated as a loan, and he now owed the company a debt he could never hope to repay. His tools and land could be seized, and he could be thrown into prison. He was caught in a perfect vice. The tax collector demanded cash, and the company's commercial agent offered the only sanctioned means of getting it, on terms that guaranteed perpetual servitude. The cultivation of indigo was, if anything, even more destructive. The plant exhausted the soil, rendering it infertile for rice cultivation for years after. The entire agricultural cycle of the region, perfected over centuries to maximize food production, was being violently re-engineered to serve the company's export portfolio. Thousands upon thousands of acres of the most fertile rice paddies in the world were being systematically converted into vast industrial-scale plantations for drugs and dyes. The cold, strategic logic behind this agricultural revolution is laid bare in the minutes of the company's Board of Trade in Calcutta. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The native cultivator's sentimental attachment to subsistence farming is a primary obstacle to the efficient monetization of this land. It is not our purpose to subsidize his diet, but to integrate him into the company's global trade network. By compelling the cultivation of opium through a system of binding advances, we secure the commodity essential to rectifying the China trade imbalance. Any localized deficits in food grain are a secondary economic concern. Indeed, a degree of scarcity may even serve to rationalize the local market. We are not merely harvesting a crop. We are harvesting a population and directing its labor toward a more profitable end." Harvesting a population. It's hard to imagine a more chillingly honest assessment. They were treating the people of Bengal as a resource, like timber or coal, to be exploited. This policy was a direct, calculated assault on the food security of the entire province. The company was actively commanding the UN planting of food. They were creating a deliberate artificial scarcity of rice, the staple food for 30 million people, in order to maximize their profits from a narcotic they were illegally smuggling into another country. The very fields that should have been filled with rice to feed the population in a coming drought were now shimmering with the fragile, beautiful, and deadly flower of the opium poppy. This is the final turn of the screw. The company had created a system that demanded cash, And then it created a system that made it impossible to earn that cash except by destroying one's own food supply. They had dismantled the public granaries, so there were no reserves. They had instituted a rigid, brutal tax system, so there was no relief. And now, they had forced the farmers to replace food with inedible, exportable commodities. They had meticulously and systematically removed every single safeguard and prepared the ground for a catastrophe. All that was needed was a spark. All that was needed was for the rains to fail, for one season, to reveal the true nature of the monstrous, hollowed-out structure they had built. The board was set. The pieces were in position. The agricultural output of Bengal had been re-engineered for export, and the population had been systematically weakened and stripped of its reserves. This created a new and unprecedented business opportunity. With the supply of food grains deliberately curtailed, the food itself became an incredibly valuable commodity. And the East India Company, never one to miss a chance to monetize misery, now moved to control not just the production of wealth, but the very market for survival. The final step in preparing the ground for a profitable famine was to seize total control of the Bengali grain trade, transforming a once open marketplace into the exclusive private property of company officials and their agents. This wasn't just good business, it was the strategic vertical integration of a catastrophe. Traditionally, the internal grain trade in Bengal was a complex network of thousands of local merchants, from the small-time village trader to the major wholesaler. It was a competitive, if imperfect, system that moved grain from surplus areas to deficit areas. The company now entered this market, not as a competitor, but as a predator with powers no local merchant could match. They wielded two primary weapons. The first was the abuse of the dastak, or trade permit. By royal decree decades earlier, the company had been granted the privilege of moving its designated export goods through Bengal without paying the internal transit taxes and tolls that all local merchants were required to pay. Now, under the Diwani, they unilaterally decided that all goods they traded, including grain for the domestic market, were covered by this exemption. An Indian merchant moving rice 100 miles upriver might have his profits eaten away by a dozen different taxes. A company agent moving the same rice paid nothing. The local competition was wiped out by design. The second weapon was sheer, brute force. Company agents known as gomastas fanned out across the countryside. They operated with the full authority of the ruling power behind them. They could and did intimidate local producers into selling their harvests at prices far below market value. They could commandeer boats and bullock carts for transport, leaving local merchants stranded. They could use the threat of a tax audit or accusations of hoarding to paralyze any rival. They weren't just participating in the market, they were rigging it at every conceivable level. The objective was simple: to establish a monopoly, or at least a controlling interest in the purchase, movement, and sale of rice. They would buy cheap from desperate and terrified farmers right after the harvest, and then hoard that grain to sell at an inflated price during the lean months before the next one. What makes this chapter particularly obscene is that much of this activity was not even for the official benefit of the East India Company's shareholders. It was for the private enrichment of the very company officials who were supposed to be governing Bengal. The governor of Bengal himself, Harry Verelst, and his second-in-command, Richard Besher, along with most of the Calcutta Council, operated vast private trading syndicates. As public officials, their duty was to ensure the stability and welfare of the province. As private businessmen, their personal fortunes now depended on maximizing price volatility and exploiting scarcity. This was a conflict of interest so profound, so utterly corrupt, that it beggars belief. The men in charge of preventing a famine were the same men who stood to become millionaires if one occurred. Here are the operational ethics of this new grain monopoly, detailed in a private letter from a senior company partner in Calcutta to his agent upcountry. Uncomfortable. Quote, "Concerning the venture in rice, your instructions are clear. You will use the company's dastak to ensure our consignments bypass all local imposts. Your purchase price will be the post-harvest nadir, the cultivator's urgent need for silver to satisfy the company. Tax collectors is to be considered your single greatest negotiating advantage. Do not engage in haggling. We are not merchants asking for a price, we are the state setting one. Your task is to secure the entire surplus of your district before the Banyans and other native speculators can act. A dry spell is predicted, which suggests that the coming season will be exceptionally profitable for our concern. Exceptionally profitable. This is the language they used. The system was now complete. It was a perfect four-stage engine of destruction. First, they had eliminated the state's emergency food reserves and social safety nets. Second, they had imposed a crushing cash tax that pushed the population into debt and desperation. Third, they had forced farmers to stop growing food for themselves and to start growing inedible cash crops for the company's export trade. And now, fourth, they had seized control of the trade in the remaining diminished food supply, giving them the power to set the price of survival itself. The East India Company had achieved something unprecedented. It had created a closed-loop system in which it controlled every lever of the economy, from production to taxation to distribution. The people of Bengal were now utterly trapped. Their ability to survive was no longer in their own hands. It was in the hands of a small group of foreign merchants in Calcutta, whose private portfolios were now directly and positively correlated with the prospect of mass starvation. For the first time, perhaps in human history, a ruling power had a direct financial incentive in the death of its subjects. Stability and surplus were now liabilities. Scarcity and desperation were assets on the rise. The crime was no longer just a matter of policy, it was a business model. A machine of this complexity, this malevolence does not build itself. It requires architects. It requires men of vision, ambition, and a particular kind of moral blindness that allows them to design a system of human suffering and call it progress. To understand the Bengal famine, we have to understand the minds of the men who set the stage for it. These were not mindless thugs. They were the best and brightest of a new corporate imperialism. Men who looked at a vibrant ancient society and saw only an underperforming asset ripe for liquidation. They were the architects of ruin. The chief architect, the man who drafted the original blueprint, was Robert Clive. Clive was a man of immense contradictions, a brilliant military strategist and a deeply depressive personality. A man capable of immense bravery and breathtaking corruption. He was the quintessential corporate raider of his age. He orchestrated the conspiracy of Plassey, and upon his return to India, devised the masterstroke of the Diwani. For Clive, Bengal was not a country. It was a prize, the ultimate score. After his first tour in India, he returned to Britain so fabulously wealthy that he staggered the political establishment. When later called before Parliament to account for the scale of his personal looting, he delivered one of the most arrogant and revealing lines in imperial history. Am I not rather entitled to be astonished at my own moderation? He saw nothing wrong with what he had done. He had taken what was there for the taking. It was Clive who established the foundational principle of the company's rule, that Bengal existed to enrich Britain, and any other consideration was secondary. If Clive was the buccaneer who kicked the door in, his successor as governor, Harry Verhulst, was the cold-eyed manager who systematized the plunder. Verhulst presided over Bengal in the years immediately preceding the famine, from 1767 to 1769. It was under his watch that the revenue demands reached their most punishing levels, and that the private trade in grain by company officials became a de facto monopoly. Verhulst was not a swashbuckling military man like Clive. He was an administrator, a bureaucrat. His contribution to the coming disaster was to refine and perfect the machine Clive had built, ensuring it ran with maximum efficiency, extracting the last possible rupee from the countryside regardless of the groans of the mechanism or the human cost of its operation. Perhaps the most damning psychological portrait, however, is that of Richard Becker, the company's resident at the Nawab's court in Murshidabad. Becker was an intelligent, observant man. He was on the ground witnessing the direct consequences of the company's policies. His own letters back to the council in Calcutta are some of the most powerful pieces of evidence against the company. He wrote in 1769, even before the famine had fully taken hold, that it must have been obvious to all that the fine country of Bengal, which flourishes under the most despotic and arbitrary government, is verging towards its ruin. He saw the impoverishment of the people, the destruction of the traditional gentry, the brutal methods of the tax collectors. He knew, with absolute clarity, that the system was a catastrophe in the making. And yet, what did he do? He enforced the company's policies. He ensured the revenue was collected. Becker represents the ultimate moral collapse at the heart of the enterprise. The man who sees the crime, understands it, documents it, and then continues to participate in it because it is his job. He is the archetype of the modern functionary of evil, the man whose conscience has been completely subordinated to his corporate duty. These men were the products of a specific culture, the nabob phenomenon. They were young, ambitious Englishmen of the middle classes, sent to India with the explicit understanding that they would make their fortunes there. They operated thousands of miles and months of travel away from any real oversight, in a land of unimaginable wealth. This created a gold rush mentality, a frantic scramble for personal enrichment that superseded all other concerns. Their entire worldview is captured in this private sentiment, echoing the thoughts of Clive and his contemporaries. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The philosophers in London speak of our duty to the natives, as if we were here on a charitable mission. They do not grasp the nature of this enterprise. Bengal is an estate, a vast, mismanaged, and deeply undervalued property. We are not its rulers. We are its new management. Our duty is to our employers, to our shareholders. In clearing away the old, inefficient customs and maximizing the yield, we perform a service. The cries of the tenantry are inevitable during such a transition, but they are a temporary inconvenience. We are here to make this land profitable, not popular. To make this land profitable, not popular." This was the core ideology, a toxic fusion of staggering greed and a profound sense of cultural and racial superiority. They saw the intricate ancient systems of Bengali governance not as a civilization, but as a mess to be cleaned up. They saw the people not as subjects to be ruled, but as human resources to be exploited. They were the pioneers of a new and terrible form of power, a corporate power that was accountable only to a ledger book in a distant city. They weren't cackling villains rubbing their hands with glee at the thought of suffering. They were worse. They were rational, detached, and utterly convinced of their own righteousness. They were businessmen, making hard decisions from the comfort of their offices in Calcutta, reducing a nation of 30 million people to a column of figures. And it is this very detachment, this bureaucratic and impersonal nature of their crime, that made an atrocity of this scale not only possible, but in their eyes, perfectly justifiable. The machine was fully assembled. Its architects were in place, confident and unblinking. The population of Bengal had been systematically disarmed of every defense against catastrophe. The entire society was a tinderbox, primed and waiting for a spark. And in the late months of 1768, that spark came. It was not yet an inferno, but a flicker, a warning shot across the bow from nature itself. A partial failure of the monsoon rains led to a significant drought in several key agricultural districts. The autumn rice harvest, the crucial almond crop that fed the province through the winter and spring, was dangerously poor in these areas. It was the first major environmental shock to occur under the company's new regime. It was a stress test. It was a clear, unambiguous warning of the system's profound fragility. And it was a warning the East India Company, in its corporate arrogance, would eagerly and profitably ignore. In any previous era, a crop failure on this scale would have triggered an immediate, if imperfect, response. The state granaries would have been opened. Tax collections in the afflicted districts would have been suspended or reduced. Local zamindars would have extended credit and support to their tenants. But now, none of these mechanisms existed. The company's system, when faced with this first test, performed exactly according to its brutal design. The tax demand remained unchanged. The company's collectors, the amils, descended on the villages with withered fields and demanded the full payment in cash, as always. Peasants who had harvested almost nothing were now flogged and tortured for failing to produce the silver they could not possibly possess. The scarcity of grain was not treated as a humanitarian crisis, but as a market opportunity. The company officials and their agents who had already monopolized the grain trade saw their moment. With supplies dwindling in the drought-hit regions, the price of rice began to skyrocket. These men, including the highest-ranking members of the Calcutta Council, opened their private warehouses, and began selling their hoarded grain at massively inflated prices to the very people their own tax policies were driving into destitution. They were simultaneously the arsonist and the seller of exorbitantly priced water. Reports of severe distress, of localized starvation, of families selling their children and abandoning their villages, began to flow from the countryside into the offices in Murshidabad and Calcutta. The company's own supervisors confirmed the disaster. Their reports were unequivocal. The harvest has failed. The people are in a desperate state. The land cannot possibly yield the revenue demanded of it. Richard Becker, from his listening post at the Nawab's court, sent stark warnings to Governor Verhulst and the Select Committee. He informed them that the province was facing a crisis of subsistence that threatened to spiral out of control. The warning lights were flashing. The alarms were sounding in every dispatch from the field. The response from the men in Calcutta is perhaps the most damning piece of evidence in this entire affair. Faced with overwhelming proof of a growing crisis and the manifest failure of their system to cope with it, they did not organize relief. They did not authorize tax remissions. They did not move to stabilize the price of grain. They did the opposite. They doubled down. Their decision is recorded in the cold, passionless language of the committee's minutes. Classified memo. The reports from the districts regarding the harvest shortfall have been reviewed. While the accounts of distress are noted, they must not serve as a pretext for any laxity in the collection of the revenue. The company's financial obligations are absolute. The supervisors are to be instructed to lend every assistance to the Naib Diwan's agents in securing the full stipulated sum. Furthermore, this scarcity provides a clear market signal. Those among us with private concerns in grain are advised that conditions are now most favorable for the disposal of existing stock. The system is demonstrating its ability to deliver returns even under adverse conditions. The present course will be maintained. This is the point of no return. This is the moment where incompetence and neglect curdle into active, conscious malice. They saw the suffering, they read the reports, and their calculated decision was that the suffering was an acceptable, even profitable externality. The localized famine of 1768-69 became a dress rehearsal, and in the company's eyes the rehearsal was a resounding success. The revenue targets were, through unimaginable brutality, largely met. The officials who had cornered the grain market made personal fortunes. From the detached perspective of a London boardroom, looking only at the flow of silver from Bengal, the system had proven its resilience. But on the ground, the province had been bled white. The peasantry was now even more impoverished, even more indebted. What little reserves of grain or cash they might have had were now completely gone. They were entering the agricultural year of 1769 in a state of extreme vulnerability. The dress rehearsal had been a triumph for the company's ledger book, but it had pushed the entire society one giant step closer to the abyss. They had heard the cries of the dying, calculated the odds, and decided to spin the wheel again. They hadn't just ignored the warning. They had interpreted it as a validation of their methods. The machine could, in fact, continue to run on human blood. After the dress rehearsal, the main performance. After the warning shot, the barrage. The agricultural year of 1769 began with a population already on its knees, depleted and indebted from the partial drought of the year before. They planted their fields, the opium and indigo demanded by the company, the rice needed for their own survival, and they looked to the sky, waiting for the life-giving monsoon. And the sky, for the first time in living memory, gave back nothing. The summer monsoon, the engine of the entire subcontinent's agricultural life, failed. It wasn't just weak, it was virtually absent. The clouds refused to form. The land baked and cracked under a relentless sun. The seedlings in the rice paddies withered and turned to dust. The great rivers of the Ganges Delta, for the first time, began to shrink in their beds. This was a natural disaster. It was a random, terrible roll of the celestial dice. And it is crucial that we make this distinction, because the apologists for the empire have spent 2 centuries blaming the sky for what happened next. A drought is an act of nature. A famine is an act of man. A drought is a deficiency of water. A famine is a deficiency of food. But more than that, it is a deficiency of compassion, a deficiency of the social and political will to keep people alive. In a healthy, resilient society, a drought as severe as 1769's would have caused immense hardship, suffering, and death. But it would not have led to the extermination of 10 million people. It would not have wiped a third of the population off the face of the earth. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 was not caused by the drought of 1769. The drought was merely the trigger. The famine was caused by the meticulous, systematic, and profit-driven policies of the British East India Company. The famine was not a failure of the company's system. It was the system operating at its peak efficiency. As the scale of the harvest failure became undeniable in late 1769, every single one of the company's policies, which had been so effective at extracting wealth in years of plenty, now transformed into an active agent of mass death. Remember the granaries emptied and left to rot because they were unprofitable? There was now no emergency reserve of food in the entire province. Remember the rigid cash tax collected with brutal force? The collectors were dispatched again to demand silver from people whose fields had produced nothing but dust. Failure to pay meant flogging, the seizure of what few possessions a family had left, their home, their tools, their starving cattle. Remember the forced cultivation of cash crops? The poppy and indigo plants had withered alongside the rice, leaving the farmers with no food, no cash, and a crushing debt to the company for the advance they had been forced to take. And finally, remember the company officials who had established a monopoly on the grain trade? As the last of the local food supplies dwindled, this syndicate saw not a humanitarian catastrophe, but the business opportunity of a lifetime. The small amounts of grain that did exist, much of it hoarded in their private warehouses from previous years, now became more valuable than gold. The market they had so carefully rigged was now poised to deliver profits on a scale that even they could barely have imagined. The price of rice, the staple of life, began to climb. First it doubled, then it tripled, then it quadrupled. By the spring of 1770, it would be 10, sometimes 15 times its normal price. A wage that could once feed a family for a week could now barely buy a single meal. The official correspondence from the Calcutta Council to the Court of Directors in London acknowledges the problem, but frames it in the sterile, self-exonerating language of corporate management. Uncomfortable. Quote, "It is with regret that we must inform the court of an unprecedented failure of the seasonal rains, the severity of which is expected to have a profound impact on the autumn harvest and consequently on the welfare of the inhabitants. This is a most unfortunate act of providence. The Council has, however, taken all necessary measures to ensure the continued security of the company's revenue. The collection will proceed with all due diligence. It must also be noted that the resultant scarcity has created a highly dynamic, if volatile market for grain, which we trust our most enterprising servants are well positioned to navigate. We anticipate a challenging year for the province, but we remain confident of a satisfactory outcome for the company's accounts. A satisfactory outcome for the company's accounts. This is the lens through which they viewed the unfolding apocalypse. They separated the welfare of the inhabitants from the security of the company's revenue, as if the two things were unrelated variables in an equation. The drought was a regrettable act of God, a convenient excuse that absolved them of all responsibility. But the collection of taxes and the profits from the grain trade were matters of business, and business would continue as usual. This wasn't a government preparing to save its people. It was a corporation preparing its shareholders for a potential write-down, while simultaneously pointing out a silver lining of speculative profit. The bomb that they had spent a decade building had just been triggered. And as the people of Bengal began to starve, the architects of the system prepared not to defuse it, but to count the money from the blast. As the catastrophic reality of the failed 1769 harvest settled over Bengal, a great and terrible scramble began. But it was not the scramble of a government rushing to distribute aid. It was not the scramble of communities trying to share their dwindling resources. It was the cold, predatory scramble of vultures descending. As the first pangs of hunger began to grip the countryside, the agents of the East India Company and the private syndicates of its highest officials fanned out across the province, not to give, but to take. Their goal was to buy up every last grain of rice that could be found. to concentrate the entire remaining food supply of a nation of 30 million people into their own hands. This was the moment the famine ceased to be a passive event and became an active, managed process. The hoarding began. Using company funds, private capital, and the full coercive power of the state, the company's gumastas swept through the districts. They went to farmers who had managed, through some miracle, to produce a small, meager crop. They went to local merchants who had small stockpiles. The farmers were desperate for cash to even attempt to pay the company's unforgiving taxes, so they were forced to sell their family's food supply for a pittance. The local merchants were in no position to argue with agents who could threaten them with violence, legal harassment, or ruinous tax audits. Any merchant who refused to sell to the company was accused of hoarding, a crime the company itself was now committing on an industrial scale. This was a classic, criminal, monopolistic practice, known in English law at the time by the terms engrossing and forestalling. Engrossing was the act of buying up a large quantity of a commodity to gain control of the market and artificially inflate the price. Forestalling was intercepting goods on their way to market and buying them up to do the same. In Britain, these were serious offenses, punishable by fines and imprisonment. They were seen as a moral crime against the community. Yet in Bengal, the very men who were supposed to be the government were now the country's biggest engrossers and forestallers. The hypocrisy was absolute. They were committing a crime in Bengal for which they would have been locked up in London. The key figure in this operation was once again the Naib Diwan, Mohammad Reza Khan. But he was not acting alone. He was the chief purchasing agent, the public face of a vast syndicate whose main partners and beneficiaries were his British masters on the Calcutta Council. They used him as a cutout, a proxy to do the dirty work of stripping the countryside of its food. The grain that was bought up, or more accurately, expropriated, was not left in the villages. It was loaded onto boats and transported to the company's central warehouses in major cities like Calcutta and Murshidabad. This had a devastating effect. It created a food desert. A village might starve while a warehouse just 50 miles away was overflowing with rice. But that rice was now corporate property, an asset on a balance sheet waiting for the market price, the price of human desperation, to reach its peak. The orders given to the agents in the field were brutally simple and are reflected in the operational directives of the time. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The reports of a failed harvest are confirmed. This represents the signal for our enterprise to commence. You are to use the full weight of the company, its authority and resources to procure every available mond of rice in your assigned district. The producer's need for cash is your primary leverage. Their desperation is your advantage. Do not hesitate to outbid any native merchants. Should they prove obstinate, remind them under whose protection you operate. All stocks are to be consolidated and moved to the central granaries for storage. We are not buying a commodity. We are acquiring the singular means of survival. By the time the hot season arrives, we will be the only sellers. And we will set the price. We will set the price. There is the entire strategy, laid bare. This was not a panicked response to a crisis. It was a cold, calculated business plan. The men orchestrating this knew that the drought had created a genuine shortage. By buying up the remaining supply, they could transform that shortage into an absolute and perfectly controlled famine. They were not just profiting from a tragedy, they were actively investing in it. Every boatload of rice they moved into their warehouses was a calculated bet on a future of mass death. They knew that in a few months millions would be insane with hunger, willing to trade their land, their homes, their children, their very souls, for a single bag of rice. And the company would be there to make the sale. This is the central, unforgivable crime of the Great Bengal Famine. It is the moment where the line between a negligent, extractive government and a predatory, genocidal enterprise is irrevocably crossed. They were not governing. They were not even just looting. They were weaponizing hunger. They were taking the population's last remaining chance of survival, locking it away and waiting for the screaming to start, because the sound of a starving nation was, to them, the beautiful sound of a rising stock price. By the spring of 1770, the plan had entered its final, most profitable phase. The hoarding was complete. The East India Company's officials and their proxies had successfully cornered the market on survival. Their warehouses in Calcutta and Murshidabad were full. The countryside, meanwhile, was empty. The last of the secret household stashes were gone. The seed grain had been eaten. The people had consumed the leaves from the trees and the grass from the fields. The slow, quiet starvation of the winter now gave way to a full-blown, screaming apocalypse. And with a captive market of millions now facing imminent death, the company's merchants opened the doors to their granaries and began to sell. This was not an act of relief. It was the moment of cashing in. The price of rice, which had already quadrupled, now exploded into the stratosphere. In districts where the company's monopoly was absolute, prices rose to 10, 15, even 20 times their normal level. A bag of rice that a farmer had been forced to sell for 1 rupee in the autumn was now sold back to his starving neighbors for 15. This wasn't a market responding to scarcity. This was price gouging on a genocidal scale, an act of calculated extortion against a population that had been systematically disarmed and impoverished by the sellers themselves. The price of staying alive for 1 more week was a family's land title. The price of feeding your children for 1 more day was to sell yourself into bondage. The horror that this unleashed is almost impossible to comprehend. Society itself began to dissolve. The bonds of family and community, stretched to the breaking point, finally snapped. Parents abandoned their children on the roadsides. Desperate people sold their sons and daughters for a few handfuls of grain. The tax collectors, the Amils, reported that villages were falling silent, the inhabitants either having fled or died. The roads to the cities were lined with the dead and the dying, skeletal figures who had walked 100 miles in the vain hope of finding food, only to collapse at the gates of a city where the warehouses were overflowing. Contemporary accounts, including those from company officials, describe scenes from a nightmare. The dead lay unburied in the streets. The rivers were clogged with bodies, and in the darkest corners of the province, the ultimate taboo was broken. People began to eat the dead. In the face of this Armageddon, what did the ruling power do? The company's official response was a masterpiece of cynical tokenism. In the capital city of Murshidabad, they allocated the grand sum of half a rupee per day to feed 7,000 people. The private correspondence of the merchants involved reveals a mindset utterly divorced from the reality they were creating. They were not witnessing a tragedy. They were celebrating a windfall. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The returns on our rice venture have surpassed even my most avaricious projections. The market price is holding steady at 15 times our initial purchase cost, and the demand, as you can imagine, remains exceptionally robust. We are measuring out rice by the seer to those who can pay, a commodity for which we bought by the cartload. The mortality in the countryside is, of course, regrettable, as it may present a challenge to finding labor for the next planting season. But the profits from our current inventory are beyond anything I have witnessed in my career. I shall return to England a nabob of the first order. It appears a biblical famine is the most lucrative business partner a man could pray for. Regrettable, a challenge for finding labor. This is how they saw the deaths of millions. The people dying in the streets were not victims. They were the market. The famine was the purest form of capitalism imaginable. They had created a product, survival, for which the demand was absolute and biological. They had eliminated all competition, and they were now charging whatever price they wished. The horror was not just that there was no food. The horror was that, for many, the food was there. It was visible. It was piled high in warehouses, protected by the company's soldiers, but it was priced out of existence. People starved to death while listening to the sounds of merchants counting the silver they had paid for their last meager meal. This was not a famine. It was a mass murder, conducted at arm's length for profit, and it was the single greatest triumph of the East India Company's business model. While the private syndicates of company officials were selling rice to the dying at impossible prices, the official, public-facing machinery of the East India Company's government was engaged in an activity that was, if anything, even more perverse. As the famine reached its zenith in the summer of 1770, as millions perished and the social order of Bengal collapsed into a hellscape of disease and starvation, the prime directive issued from the Governor's Council in Calcutta remained unchanged, unwavering, and absolute. Collect the taxes. in the midst of the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in 18th century India. The primary function of the state was not relief, not crisis management, not even the maintenance of basic order. It was the relentless and violent collection of revenue from a population that was literally ceasing to exist. This policy is at first glance so counterintuitive that it seems insane. What government actively seeks to extract money from the dead and the dying? Even the most ruthless despot understands that a dead peasant is a non-performing asset. But the East India Company was not a government in any traditional sense. It was a corporation, and its decisions were driven by a corporate, not a political logic. To grant a remission of taxes would be to admit a loss on the books, a loss that would have to be explained to the shareholders in London. It would cause the company's stock price to fall. It would also, they feared, set a dangerous precedent, encouraging the natives to expect leniency in future years. The suffering of the population was a temporary variable. The integrity of the revenue stream, however, was a sacred constant. And so, the Amils and their armed thugs were sent out into the silent villages. They were tasked with collecting silver from people who had no food, let alone money. The methods they used reached a new level of desperation and cruelty. They flogged skeletal men and women who couldn't pay. They seized the last remaining possessions of families on the brink of death: a cooking pot, a farming tool, the wooden door of a hut. They engaged in a grotesque form of asset stripping on a dying society, shaking down ghosts for their last pennies. It was a theater of the absurd, a macabre dance of bureaucratic duty performed in a charnel house. The official instructions sent from the British supervisors to their Indian deputies like Muhammad Reza Khan were utterly devoid of any human feeling. They were the directives of an algorithm, a program that could not be stopped. Classified memo. The high rate of mortality you report is acknowledged. However, the company's financial commitments cannot be made subject to the seasonal fortunes or the very constitution of the peasantry. The land assessment for each district is fixed and must be met. Where a cultivator has expired, his tax burden falls upon the village as a whole. Where an entire village has been lost, its assessment must be reapportioned among the surviving settlements of the district. You are to employ all necessary rigor and omit no measure of severity to ensure the collections for this year are realized in full. We expect results, not lamentations, reapportioned among the survivors. Read that again. The company's official policy was that the living must pay the debts of the dead. As the tax base shrank through mass death, the tax burden on those who remained grew heavier. But the company's ghoulish arithmetic went even further than that. In 1771, as the immediate crisis began to recede, revealing a depopulated and shattered landscape, the council in Calcutta looked at the revenue figures. They noted the shortfall caused by the inconvenient deaths of 10 million people. Their solution? They raised the general rate of land tax assessment on the survivors by a further 10%. They were, in the most literal sense, taxing the ghosts of the dead, forcing the living to pay for the land that now lay fallow and unowned. The success of this monstrous policy was later admitted, with a kind of perverse pride, by the man who would succeed Verhulst as governor, Warren Hastings. In a report to the Court of Directors in 1772, Hastings coolly noted the facts of the situation. He wrote, "Notwithstanding the loss of at least 1/3 of the inhabitants of the province and the consequent decrease of the cultivation, the net collections of the year 1771 exceeded even those of 1768. Let that sink in. After 10 million people had died, after 1/3 of the workforce had been eliminated, the company managed to squeeze more money out of the survivors than they had from the entire, thriving population 3 years earlier. There is no clearer confession. There is no more damning piece of evidence. This was not a government that failed its people. This was a machine that had been designed to operate completely independently of the life or death of the people it was supposed to govern. Its only input was the land, its only output was silver, and the human beings in between were simply an obstacle to be crushed if they got in the way of the process. A state that prioritizes revenue over the survival of its people has ceased to be a state. It has become something else, a predator wearing the mask of a government. It is a paradox that breaks the laws of economics, a defiance of logic so profound it borders on the surreal. as Bengal's population withered, as its fields lay fallow and its looms fell silent. The river of silver flowing from its shores to the ports of Britain did not slow. It did not stop, it accelerated. While a third of the inhabitants of the province were wiped from the earth, the East India Company's revenues, as Warren Hastings proudly reported, reached an all-time high. This is the central, horrifying equation of the famine. The death of millions in the East was directly and mathematically correlated with the enrichment of a handful of shareholders and gentlemen in the West. To understand the full scope of the crime, you have to follow the money. The wealth flowed through two primary channels. The first was the company's official revenue. The millions of pounds sterling collected through the brutal taxation of a dying populace were recorded in the ledgers in Calcutta. After the trivial sums were paid out to the puppet Nawab and the captive emperor, this vast surplus constituted the company's profit. This money was used to purchase Indian goods, textiles, saltpeter, silks, at artificially low prices, which were then shipped to England and sold at an enormous markup. This was the investment that paid the handsome, and for a time record-breaking dividends to the company's shareholders in London. It was Bengali tax money, collected from skeletal farmers, that was funding the comfortable retirements of vicars and merchants in the English countryside. The second channel was the private plunder, the truly obscene fortunes amassed by the company's officials, the nabobs. The profits from their illegal grain monopoly, the bribes, the extortion, this river of dark money was repatriated to Britain through a complex system of bills of exchange and the smuggling of diamonds. This private wealth was so immense it reshaped the political and social landscape of Britain itself. These newly minted millionaires returned home and bought their way into the aristocracy. They purchased vast country estates, built palatial manors, and most importantly, they bought seats in Parliament, giving the East India Company a powerful, self-interested voting bloc at the very heart of the British government. But the impact was far greater than a few new mansions. This sudden, violent injection of capital from Bengal into the British economy was a key ingredient in the ignition of the Industrial Revolution. Historians have long debated the sources of the capital that financed the first factories in Manchester and the first steam engines in the Midlands. A significant portion of it came directly from the plunder of India. The Bengal famine was not just a humanitarian disaster. It was one of the largest and fastest transfers of wealth in human history. This was the drain of wealth, as Indian nationalists would later call it. It was not trade. It was a systematic, unilateral siphoning of the economic lifeblood of one continent to fuel the industrial expansion of another. The gears of Britain's new industrial age were being greased with the fat of a starving land. The view from Leadenhall Street in London, the company's headquarters, was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. Shareholders clamored for their cut of the Bengal windfall, and the chairman of the company was happy to oblige. Uncomfortable. Quote, "Gentlemen of the company, it is my distinct pleasure to report that the past financial year has been one of unprecedented profitability. Despite certain demographic challenges and agricultural disruptions in the Bengal province, our net revenues have remained remarkably robust, a testament to the sound and vigorous administration of our servants on the ground. The dividend this year, I am pleased to announce, will be a record 12.5%. Let the bleeding hearts in Parliament raise their objections. The numbers on the ledger, gentlemen, do not lie. The Indian revenue stream is no longer merely a branch of this nation's commerce. It is rapidly becoming the very fountainhead of its prosperity. The numbers do not lie, but they do tell a horrific story if you know how to read them. The number 12.5%, a figure celebrated in a London boardroom, was written in the blood of 10 million people. The fountainhead of prosperity in Britain had its source in a delta of bones in Bengal. This is the uncomfortable reality that is so often edited out of the triumphant story of Western progress. The two events, the famine and the revolution, are not separate stories. They are two sides of the same coin. One society was being systematically deindustrialized, shattered, and impoverished, so that another, halfway across the world, could build the factories and machines that would allow it to dominate the globe for the next 2 centuries. The river of silver was flowing and every coin was a ghost. A crime of this magnitude cannot be sustained by force alone. It must be sustained by a story. As the river of silver flowed from the ruins of Bengal into the coffers of London, it was accompanied by a parallel river of ink, official dispatches, reports, and letters designed to construct a narrative, a carefully managed fiction that would explain away the horror and justify the profits to Parliament and the British public. The first and most crucial phase of any cover-up is controlling the story, and in an age when information traveled at the speed of a sail, the East India Company had a 6-month head start on the truth. They used it to build a fortress of lies. The official narrative, meticulously crafted in the council rooms of Calcutta and sent back to Leadenhall Street, was a masterclass in corporate public relations. It was built on 3 core pillars of deception. The first and most important was to blame nature. In every dispatch, the famine was framed as an act of providence, a melancholy visitation, a calamity of nature. The unprecedented failure of the monsoon was presented not as the trigger, but as the sole and complete cause of the tragedy. It was an event beyond any human control, an unfortunate accident for which no one, certainly not the company, could possibly be held responsible. The language was passive, fatalistic, and drenched in a kind of feigned piety. The second pillar was the complete and total omission of the company's own role. Reading the official reports, you would never know that the company had systematically dismantled Bengal's famine defenses. You would never know they had imposed a ruinous cash tax system. You would not read a single word about the forced cultivation of opium, the monopoly on grain, the hoarding, or the obscene price gouging by its own officials. The entire decade of policy decisions that had primed the province for destruction was surgically excised from the record. It simply did not happen. The third pillar of the lie was to paint the company as the heroic, if tragically overwhelmed savior of the Bengali people. The pathetic token relief efforts, the $9,000 spent, a fraction of a percent of their revenue, were inflated into a grand, humanitarian campaign. They wrote of their servants working tirelessly to alleviate the distress, of distributing rice in the capitals, and of doing everything in their power to combat the cruelty of fate. The perpetrators of the famine were successfully recasting themselves as its first responders. This official version of events is perfectly encapsulated in the tone and content of the annual dispatch sent from the governor in council to the court of directors in London. Uncomfortable, quote, "It is our most somber duty to report on the severe and widespread distress that has afflicted the province this past year, owing entirely to a failure of the seasonal rains of a magnitude hitherto unknown in the annals of this land. This natural calamity, which no human foresight or endeavor could possibly have prevented, has unfortunately resulted in a considerable mortality among the lower classes of inhabitants. The company, guided by principles of humanity, has spared no expense in its efforts to alleviate the suffering, distributing rice daily in the principal cities and offering what succor was possible in the face of such overwhelming misfortune. Despite these grave challenges to the province, we are pleased to report that through the diligent and tireless efforts of our servants, the company's revenue has been largely secured and public order has been maintained. Considerable mortality, lower classes, diligent efforts. It is the sterile, euphemistic language of a modern corporate press release announcing a factory closure. This document and others like it became the official truth. It was this version of the story that the company's chairman presented to the British Parliament. It was this version that was summarized in the London newspapers. A lie, laundered through the channels of bureaucracy, had become historical fact. And in doing so, they created the template, the colonial famine playbook that the British Empire would use for the next 150 years. Step 1, blame the weather. Step 2, blame the victims, their indolence, their improvidence. Step 3, praise the heroic, selfless efforts of the colonial administration. This narrative was deployed time and again from Ireland to India, a rhetorical shield to deflect blame for systemic, policy-driven starvation. The Bengal famine was not just a physical atrocity, it was the birthplace of an intellectual one. Of course, the truth could not be entirely suppressed. Sailors, disgruntled former employees, and rival merchants brought back whispers of the real story. Whispers of mountains of hoarded rice, of company officials becoming millionaires overnight, of a death toll that beggared belief. But these were just stories, easily dismissed by the company's powerful political lobby as the jealous slander of malcontents. The company controlled the paper trail. They had the official records. And in a battle between a ghost story and a ledger book, the ledger book always wins. The first casualty of the famine wasn't a Bengali peasant. It was the truth. While the East India Company was busy winning the information war in London, a different kind of crisis was brewing. One that even its formidable propaganda machine couldn't conceal. It was a crisis of success. The nabobs, returning from India dripping in diamonds and vulgar new wealth, were becoming a political and social embarrassment. They bought their way into high society and parliament, corrupting the old order with their foreign fortunes. At the very same time, the company itself, despite the record revenues from Bengal, was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Years of expensive wars, rampant internal corruption and mismanagement had brought the world's most profitable corporation to its knees. This paradox, a company drowning in debt while its employees became the richest men in the kingdom, created a scandal so great that the British Parliament was finally forced to intervene. In 1772, a select committee was formed to investigate the company's affairs. But we must be absolutely clear about the purpose of this investigation. It was not a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the victims of the Bengal famine. The 10 million dead were, at best, a footnote, a piece of circumstantial evidence. The real target of the inquiry was the company's power and the destabilizing influence of the nabobs' wealth. The British ruling class was terrified that this private corporation had become a state within a state, a rogue entity powerful enough to threaten the sovereignty of Parliament itself. The question that consumed Westminster was not, what did the company do to Bengal? But what is the company's wealth doing to Britain? The result of this political maneuvering was the Regulating Act of 1773. On the surface, it was presented as a landmark piece of reform, the moment the British state finally stepped in to impose morality and order on the company's chaotic and rapacious rule. The act established the post of a Governor-General in Bengal, created a new Supreme Court in Calcutta, and required the company to submit its records to government oversight. It was heralded as the dawn of responsible governance. This is a lie. The Regulating Act was not an act of justice. It was a hostile takeover. It was the state moving in to seize control of the world's most profitable criminal enterprise. The act did nothing to punish the perpetrators of the famine. Robert Clive, the architect of the whole system, was censured but ultimately celebrated by Parliament as a hero who had rendered great and meritorious services to his country. No official was prosecuted for the price gouging. No fundamental change was made to the revenue extraction system. The real purpose of the act was not to stop the crime, but to regulate it, to manage it, and most importantly, to ensure that the profits flowed in the right direction. It was a power struggle between the old establishment and a new corporate power, and the prize was the treasury of India. The true motive is revealed not in the public debates but in the private correspondence of the men who ran the country. Men like the Prime Minister, Lord North. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The conduct of the company's servants in the East has become an intolerable challenge to the dignity of the Crown. Their private fortunes are a source of corruption here at home, and their mismanagement threatens a vital source of national revenue. The question before us is not the sentimental one of the Indians' welfare. That is a matter for missionaries. The question is one of sovereignty. Who is to be the master of this Indian empire and its wealth? A cartel of unaccountable merchants in Leadenhall Street or His Majesty's government? This act is not designed to put the company out of business. It is designed to make the state its senior partner and eventually its sole proprietor. To make the state its senior partner. That was the entire game. And the mechanism for this takeover was a bailout. As part of the act, the British government gave the nearly bankrupt company a massive loan of $1.4 million. In exchange for this financial rescue, the company had to submit to the new government controls. It was a classic leveraged buyout. The state saved the company from its own excesses, and in return, it took a controlling stake in the enterprise. The plunder of Bengal was not to be stopped. It was to be nationalized. This moment represents a terrifying evolution in the nature of imperialism. Before this, the company was a private predator. After the Regulating Act, it became a semi-official organ of the British state. The exploitation of India was no longer just a corporate policy. It was now sanctioned, supervised, and ultimately guaranteed by the British Crown. The act wasn't a punishment for the famine, it was a promotion for the perpetrators. It wrapped their criminal enterprise in the flag, giving the veneer of national legitimacy to what was and would continue to be a system of pure extraction. The state didn't come to save the victims, it came to get its cut of the spoils. With the British state now the senior partner in the enterprise of looting Bengal, a new kind of manager was required. The Regulating Act of 1773 appointed the first ever Governor-General, a man named Warren Hastings. Hastings was no thuggish nabob. He was a brilliant, complex, and ruthless administrator, a career company man who understood India intimately. His task was not to end the exploitation, but to make it more efficient, more orderly, and more sustainable for the long-term benefit of the British state. He inherited the system that had produced the famine, and he spent the next decade consolidating its power. But the stench of the company's crimes, and particularly the vulgarity of the nabob's wealth, still lingered in the air in London. The nation needed a reckoning. It needed a show. And so it was decided that there would be a trial. The impeachment of Warren Hastings, which began in Westminster Hall in 1788, was the political spectacle of the century. For 7 years, it was the focus of British public life. The prosecution was led by some of the greatest orators of the age, most notably the philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke. Burke, in speeches that lasted for days, painted Hastings as a rapacious tyrant, a captain general of iniquity who had trampled on the ancient laws of India and stained the honor of the British name. The charges were lurid and specific: the extortion of treasure from Indian princesses, the sanctioning of torture, the judicial murder of a political rival. It was high drama, and all of London society flocked to watch. But listen closely to the charges. Listen to the grand speeches. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770, the foundational crime that killed 10 million people, and from which the entire corrupt system flowed, was conspicuously absent from the formal articles of impeachment. Burke mentioned it, of course, as part of the general landscape of horror that the company had created. But the trial was not about the famine. It was not about the system of policies that had engineered mass death for profit. The trial was about the alleged personal crimes and corrupt dealings of one man, Warren Hastings, in the years after the famine. This was not an accident, it was the entire point of the exercise. This was a theatrical performance designed to cleanse a nation's conscience. It was a show trial. By placing one man in the dock, the British establishment could create the illusion of accountability, without ever having to question the legitimacy of the imperial project itself. An observer in the gallery, a cynical member of Parliament, might have recorded this in his private journal. Uncomfortable. Quote, Mr. Burke's performance today was a triumph of the orator's art. He depicted Hastings as the very incarnation of Oriental despotism, a ravenous beast let loose upon the gentle natives. The ladies in the gallery swooned at the appropriate moments. It is a marvelous and necessary ritual. We are all participating in the public condemnation of imperial excess, but no one here seriously proposes that we give India back. This is not about justice for the dead. It is about moral ablution for the living. We are washing the blood from the prophets by publicly scourging the man who collected them. Once the performance is over, the business of empire can continue, but now, with the satisfying feeling that we have done the right thing. The trial's purpose was to personify a systemic crime in a single, prosecutable individual. The complex, bureaucratic, policy-driven atrocity of the famine was too big, too abstract, and frankly, too implicating for everyone involved, from the shareholder to the parliamentarian. It was much easier to blame a scapegoat. The trial allowed Britain to have a grand public debate about the morality of its empire, to wring its hands and weep for the victims, all while the system of extraction in India continued uninterrupted. It was a way to address the symptoms, the corrupt nabobs, without ever having to diagnose the disease. the fundamentally criminal nature of the enterprise itself. And after 7 long years of this political theater, what was the result? Warren Hastings was acquitted on every single charge. The British establishment, having put on its show of moral outrage, ultimately closed ranks and protected its own. The system had been given its trial by proxy and had been found not guilty. The impeachment of Warren Hastings was, in the end, the final and most brilliant part of the cover-up. It was an act of national catharsis. It took the widespread systemic guilt for the Bengal catastrophe, focused it onto one man, subjected him to a decade of public scrutiny, and then, by acquitting him, it implicitly absolved the entire system. The question of the famine was buried. The question of the company's right to rule was settled. The scapegoat had served his purpose. The nation felt clean again. And the now state-sanctioned machine of empire, polished and serviced by its new government mechanics, was ready to roll forward, leaving the ghosts of Bengal to be forgotten by history. While the great men of Britain performed their 7-year passion play in Westminster Hall, the curtain had long since fallen on the tragedy in Bengal. After the sound and fury of the trial, the verdict, and the self-congratulation, there was only a profound and deathly silence. To understand what the East India Company had truly done, we must leave the marbled halls of London and return to the ground, to walk through the once fertile plains of Bengal in the years after 1770. What the survivors found was not a society recovering from a crisis. It was the ruins of a civilization. The sheer scale of the depopulation is a black hole in history, a number so large it becomes abstract. 10 million people, 1/3 of the population, gone in the space of 2 years. In the hardest hit districts like Purnea and Birbhum, the mortality rate was over 50%. Entire families, entire villages, entire bloodlines were simply erased from existence. This was not a wound from which a society could easily recover. It was a demographic collapse on a scale that Europe had not seen since the Black Death. And the landscape left behind was a testament to this loss. Company officials traveling through the countryside to assess the damage to their revenue stream sent back dispatches that paint a bleak and uniform picture. They described a land of weeds. Vast tracts of what had once been the most productive rice paddies in the world were now abandoned, overgrown with a thick, impassable jungle grass known as cans. Villages that had once bustled with life were now silent, their huts collapsing into the earth, the streets empty save for the bones of the unburied. The intricate network of irrigation canals and reservoirs, the life support system of Bengali agriculture maintained for centuries by collective labor, had silted up and fallen into ruin. There were simply not enough living people left to maintain them. But the famine destroyed more than just people and infrastructure. It destroyed knowledge. It was a great cultural burning. The most skilled artisans, the master weavers who held the secrets of producing the legendary Dhaka muslins, were gone. The most experienced farmers, the men who carried in their heads a generational library of information about soil, water, and seeds, were dead. The intellectual and social capital of a society, its accumulated expertise, was decimated. The engine of what had been a global economic powerhouse had been smashed, its most vital components lost forever. The textile industry, crippled by the death of its workforce and the collapse of its markets, went into a terminal decline. This was the beginning of the de-industrialization of Bengal, a process that would continue for the next century, transforming it from a producer of high-value goods for the world into a mere supplier of raw materials for British factories. A British supervisor, touring his assigned district in 1772, filed this report, a document of cold, bureaucratic horror that focused only on the bottom line. Uncomfortable. Quote, "My survey of the revenue lands is now complete. The effects of the mortality during the late famine are everywhere apparent. Of the 450 villages in this jurisdiction which paid revenue in 1768, over 120 are now entirely without inhabitants and are being rapidly reclaimed by jungle. A further 100 are so depopulated as to be incapable of cultivating more than a fraction of their lands. The immediate consequence is a catastrophic shortfall in the Honorable Company's revenue. The task before us is not one of providing relief, as the period of distress is past. It is a task of radical reassessment. A new system must be devised to render the remaining labor on the remaining land profitable to the company once more. The period of distress is past. This is how they spoke of an apocalypse. Their response to this wasteland was not a plan for reconstruction or humanitarian aid. It was a business problem to be solved. How could they re-engineer this shattered, depopulated land to make it profitable again? Their gaze was already fixed on the next phase of social and economic engineering, which would culminate in the infamous Permanent Settlement of 1793, another top-down revolution that would dispossess millions and lock in the poverty of the region for a century. This is the true legacy of the famine. It wasn't a temporary event. It was a great severing. It was a wall of fire that separated the old, prosperous independent Bengal from the new impoverished and broken Bengal that would become the jewel in Britain's imperial crown. The company did not just kill 10 million people. It killed a society's past and stole its future. It induced a state of collective, generational trauma from which the region would never fully recover. The paradise of nations was gone forever, replaced by a haunted land of weeds and ghosts. A perfectly blank slate upon which the British Empire could now write its own story. An atrocity, once committed and unpunished, does not simply become a memory. It becomes a precedent. It becomes a lesson. And the lesson that the East India Company, and by extension the burgeoning British Empire, learned from the Great Bengal Famine, was not one of humility or caution. It was a lesson in the terrifying, brutal effectiveness of their own methods. From the cold, detached perspective of a colonial administrator or a corporate shareholder, the famine, for all its horror, was a resounding success. It had been financially profitable, it had been politically effective, and they had gotten away with it. In the ruins of Bengal, a blueprint was drawn up, an unwritten playbook for how to manage a colony for maximum profit, a blueprint for starvation that would be refined and deployed across the globe for the next 150 years. The first principle of this new playbook was the systematic destruction of food sovereignty. The Bengal experiment had proven that a population that feeds itself is a population that is difficult to control. The solution was to aggressively re-engineer colonial agriculture to prioritize the cultivation of high-value cash crops for export, rather than food for local consumption. In India, this meant forcing farmers to grow cotton, indigo, and opium instead of rice and millet. In the Caribbean, it was sugar. In Malaya, it was rubber. This policy achieved two critical goals. It generated commodities that could be sold for massive profits on the global market, and it made the colonized population dependent on that same market for their own survival, a market that was of course controlled by Britain. The second principle, refined to perfection in Bengal, was the universal imposition of rigid, cash-based taxes. This was the engine that drove the entire system. By demanding payment in currency, not in kind, the colonial state forced every farmer into the monetized economy on its own terms. It created a constant, inescapable pressure to sell crops or labor, often at ruinous prices, just to satisfy the tax collector. This system was the perfect tool for prying wealth out of a subsistence economy and transferring it to the imperial core. The third, and perhaps most insidious principle, was the weaponization of economic ideology. As the Victorian era dawned, the ruthless pragmatism of the East India Company was given a new, intellectual gloss. The quasi-religious doctrine of laissez-faire, or the free market. When famines inevitably struck the now brittle colonial economies, this ideology provided the perfect justification for deliberate inaction. To interfere with the grain market, to provide widespread government relief, was now seen as a violation of the natural laws of economics. High food prices were not a sign of a crisis, but a market signal that would supposedly entice merchants to bring food. Of course, this was the same lie as in 1770, but now it had the weight of scientific theory behind it. This ideology allowed colonial administrators to watch millions starve and tell themselves they were practicing sound, modern economic policy. The fourth and final principle was the perfection of narrative control, the playbook first written in the dispatches about Bengal. Every colonial famine was to be explained away using the same three-part formula. First, blame nature. Second, blame the victims for their supposed laziness or for having too many children. And third, praise the heroic but tragically limited relief efforts of the colonial state. This story was repeated so often it became the unquestioned truth, a comforting fiction that insulated the British public from the horrific consequences of their own empire. This blueprint, forged in Bengal, was not a secret document locked in a vault. It was a set of ideas, an administrative culture that was passed down from one generation of colonial officials to the next. It's written in the margins of their handbooks, in the private letters they sent home. Uncomfortable. Quote, "A governor must be guided by his head, not his heart. The colony's purpose is to be a profitable asset to the empire. To that end, the transition from primitive subsistence farming to the cultivation of cash crops for export must be the paramount goal. Should a famine arise, as it inevitably will from time to time, the administrator must resist the sentimental call for massive state intervention. The market, in its wisdom, is the only true distributor of resources. A famine, while tragic, serves the larger Malthusian purpose of culling the surplus population. Your duty is not to feed the idle, but to maintain order, protect property, and ensure the revenue flows uninterrupted. This is the hard science of colonial governance. This was the logic that presided over the Great Madras Famine of 1877, the late Victorian famines that killed tens of millions across India, and even the Irish potato famine. The details changed, but the blueprint remained the same. Prioritize extraction, enforce cash taxes, let the free market sort out the ensuing starvation, and control the story. The Bengal famine was a laboratory, an experiment in a new kind of power, and the results of that experiment echoed for a century. In the silent skeletal bodies of millions, from the Ganges Delta to the plains of Connemara, a blueprint is useless if it is not used. And the brutal, effective blueprint for profitable starvation, forged in the crucible of the 1770 Bengal famine, would not be left on the shelf. It became the guiding document, the dark gospel of British imperial administration in India for the next 2 centuries. The Great Famine of 1770 was not an anomaly. It was the prototype. It was the first in a long and horrifying series of man-made famines that would convulse the subcontinent under British rule, each one following the same deadly pattern, each one justified by the same cold, inhuman logic. The names and dates change, but the story remains the same. Fast forward 1 century to 1876. The East India Company is gone, replaced by the direct rule of the British Crown. The monarch is now the Empress of India. The administration is more sophisticated, the bureaucracy more refined. But the blueprint remains. A catastrophic failure of the monsoon devastates huge swathes of southern and western India. It is the trigger for the Great Famine of 1876-78. And the response of the Viceroy, Lord Lytton, is a perfect, chilling echo of the Company Halas policies in 1770. The affected regions had been aggressively converted to the cultivation of cash crops, particularly cotton, to feed the mills of Manchester, at the expense of local, drought-resistant food grains. The population was, by design, more vulnerable than ever before. Lord Lytton, a fervent disciple of the most extreme laissez-faire economic doctrines, forbade any government interference in the private grain market. His administration-AS official position was that the natural laws of supply and demand must be allowed to work, even as prices soared and millions starved. His famine commissioner, Sir Richard Temple, articulated the government's policy with a clarity that is breathtaking in its cruelty. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The object of our relief is to save life, but we must do so at the smallest cost to the state. There is to be no interference of any kind with the object of reducing the price of food. The doctrine of the free market is our only safe guide, and any deviation from it would be a public calamity far greater than the famine itself." A sentiment directly reflecting the official policy of the Lytton administration. A public calamity far greater than the famine itself. This is how they described the act of feeding starving people. While Lytton and his officials were refusing to intervene, British merchants were continuing to export a record 10 million hundredweight of wheat from India to the United Kingdom. There was no shortage of food in India as a whole. only a shortage of political will to get it to the people who needed it. The relief Lytton did provide consisted of forced labor camps, where the caloric ration was lower than that provided to the inmates of the Buchenwald concentration camp 60 years later. The result of this perfect application of the Bengal blueprint? An estimated death toll of between 5.5 and 10 million people. Now fast forward again to 1943. We are back in Bengal. The world is at war. The British Raj is fighting for its life against the Axis powers, and famine returns to the land of its birth. The trigger this time is the Japanese conquest of Burma, cutting off a key source of rice imports. But the cause, once again, is British policy. Winston Churchill's wartime cabinet, in a desperate effort to secure resources for the war, systematically diverted food and transport away from rural Bengal. They implemented a scorched earth rice denial policy, seizing grain stocks to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. They confiscated thousands of civilian boats, the lifeblood of the Delta's transport system, destroying the ability of local markets to function. When the famine began to rage, the response from London was not just indifference, it was contempt. The Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, and the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, sent desperate telegrams to Churchill's war cabinet, begging for shipments of food aid. Their requests were repeatedly denied. Churchill, who famously declared his hatred for Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion, personally blocked the relief efforts. He reasoned that any diversion of shipping would harm the war effort. And anyway, the famine was the Indians' own fault for breeding like rabbits. The blueprint was once again in full effect. The needs of the empire came first, the lives of its subjects a distant second. The result was the Bengal famine of 1943. An estimated 3 million people starved to death. From 1770 to 1877 to 1943, the pattern is undeniable. The technology changes, the justifications are updated, but the core calculus remains identical. Whether for corporate profit, for the sake of a rigid economic ideology, or for the prosecution of a global war, the result for the people of India was the same. The British Empire did not accidentally preside over a series of tragic famines. It repeatedly and deliberately implemented a system in which Indian lives were deemed an acceptable and necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the empire. The ghost of 1770 was not a memory. It was a hungry and recurring specter that haunted the entire duration of the British Raj. The echoes of a catastrophe are not only measured in the number of the dead, but in the silences of the living. An event on the scale of the Great Bengal Famine does more than just kill. It maims the soul of a society. It inflicts a wound so deep, a trauma so profound, that it reshapes the collective psyche of a people for generations to come. And this, from the cold, strategic perspective of an occupying power, was perhaps the famine's most useful and lasting consequence. The famine did what no army could have done. It psychologically broke Bengal's will to resist, creating a state of permanent dependency that would serve the British Empire for the next 2 centuries. Before the famine, Bengal was a proud, prosperous, and complex society. It had its own powerful aristocracy, a wealthy and influential merchant class, and a vast population of skilled artisans and independent farmers. These were the very classes of people who, under normal circumstances, would have formed the backbone of any serious resistance to foreign rule. The famine systematically liquidated them. The old zamindars were bankrupted by the impossible tax demands. The merchant class was wiped out by the company's monopolistic practices. The weavers and artisans starved at their silent looms. The independent peasantry was reduced to a desperate landless mass. The company did not merely conquer Bengal. The famine hollowed it out from the inside, leaving an empty shell. Into this vacuum of power and spirit stepped the British, no longer as mere traders or tax collectors, but as the self-proclaimed arbiters of order. They had shattered the old world and all of its certainties, and now they presented themselves as the only possible architects of the new one. This is a classic tactic of psychological abuse, deployed on a national scale. First, you isolate and break down your victim, destroying their confidence and their support systems. Then you present yourself as their sole protector, their only hope for salvation from the chaos you yourself have created. The famine induced a state of collective shock. a societal post-traumatic stress disorder. And in this traumatized state, the people of Bengal became, in the eyes of the British, perfectly pliable subjects. The new colonial administrators, reflecting on the aftermath, understood this political windfall with chilling clarity. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The great mortality of 1770, while regrettable from a human standpoint, has proven to be a powerful clarifying agent in the political sphere. It has effectively swept away the decadent and fractious native aristocracy and shattered the insolence of the merchant guilds. The general populace, having been reduced to a state of utter dependency, is now far more governable, their attention fixed upon the immediate needs of subsistence rather than any fanciful notions of sovereignty. We are no longer seen as merely their tax collectors. We are now the sole guarantors of order, the ultimate authority on life and death. A lasting empire is not built upon the prosperity of its subjects, but upon their compliance." The ruin that the company had authored became the central justification for their continued rule. This is perhaps the most cynical inversion of logic in the entire history of colonialism. The British could now point to the poverty, the chaos, and the broken infrastructure of post-famine Bengal as definitive proof that Indians were incapable of governing themselves. The evidence of the crime was expertly reframed as the justification for the occupation. The arsonist stood in the ashes of the house he had torched and proclaimed that the fire was proof of the former owner's incompetence and that he alone was qualified to rebuild. This was the birth of the civilizing mission narrative in India, a lie built on a foundation of bones. This psychological subjugation, this memory of hunger, became a permanent feature of the colonial relationship. It created a culture of fatalism, a belief that resistance was futile against a power that could, seemingly at will, command both the market and the heavens. The famine had demonstrated the absolute and terrifying power of the new rulers. They could make the rains fail, make the rice disappear, and turn silver into a weapon of mass destruction. A power this total does not need to rule by the sword alone. It rules by lodging itself in the minds of the colonized, creating the deepest and most enduring of chains, the belief in one's own inherent inferiority. This was the true and lasting victory of the famine for the British Empire. It wasn't just a plunder of wealth, it was a plunder of the soul. We have now followed the trail of the crime from the boardrooms of London to the parched fields of Bengal. We have examined the methods, the motives, and the consequences. We have documented the destruction of a society and the systematic plunder of its wealth. And now we arrive at the final, most uncomfortable question, the one that hangs over this entire history like a shroud. It is a question that most mainstream historians will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid. Was the Great Bengal Famine a genocide? The word is a landmine. It is the most heavily charged term in our moral and political vocabulary, and for good reason. It denotes the crime of crimes. To use it is to make the gravest possible accusation. So let us be precise. Let us be forensic. Let us look at the definition of genocide as laid down by the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1948. The convention defines genocide as any of a number of acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. The immediate objection, the standard defense, hinges on that word, intent. The apologists for the company will argue correctly that their primary motive was not the extermination of the Bengali people for racial or ethnic reasons. Their primary motive was profit. They did not wake up in the morning with a desire to kill Bengalis. They woke up with a desire to maximize shareholder value. But the UN definition does not stop there. It goes on to list the specific acts that constitute genocide. One of them is this: deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Read that clause again. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Now, hold that definition against the facts. Were the company's policies deliberate? Yes. The destruction of the granaries, the imposition of cash taxes, the forced cultivation of opium, the monopolization of the grain trade, these were conscious, documented policy decisions. Were these conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction? Given a predictable event like a drought, the answer is unequivocally yes. The company's own officials, men like Richard Becker, warned them of the coming ruin. They had seen the system's deadly results in the smaller famine of 1768. They had the data. They knew precisely what the consequences of their policies would be. They made the calculation, and they accepted considerable mortality as the price of doing business. The debate, then, comes back to motive versus intent. Let us use an analogy. If I set fire to an occupied apartment building with the motive of collecting the insurance money, can I stand in court and claim that I did not intend to kill the residents? My motive was profit, not murder. But murder was the direct, foreseeable, and inevitable consequence of the method I chose to achieve my profit. The law makes no such fine distinction. The intent is inferred from the actions. Let us imagine for a moment a hypothetical international tribunal putting the ghost of the East India Company on trial. The closing argument for the prosecution might sound something like this. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The defense, in their closing remarks, will no doubt argue that the company's motive was mere profit, not the extermination of a people. They will claim this was business, not hatred. This is a distinction without a moral or legal difference. If I lock a man in a bank vault to die, my motive may be to rob the bank, but my intent towards that man is murderous." The accused in this case, the East India Company, deliberately locked an entire nation inside a vault of engineered scarcity. They created the vault by destroying every traditional defense against hunger. They knew the vault was airtight. Their own servants warned them. They heard the cries of the dying from within, and they refused to open the door. In fact, they charged the dying an admission fee to get back out. Their motive was profit. The method they deliberately chose to achieve that profit was genocide. This is why the word is so fiercely resisted in academic and political discourse. To label the Bengal famine a genocide is to recategorize it. It ceases to be a tragic but distant chapter of economic history and becomes an active crime against humanity, a crime with perpetrators and victims, a crime that implicates the very foundations of the British Empire and, by extension, the origins of the modern global economy. It is far more comfortable to use antiseptic phrases like policy-driven mortality or man-made famine. These terms are accurate, but they are sedatives. They numb us to the moral enormity of what was done. Whether the company's actions fit the 1948 legal definition to the letter is a debate for lawyers. But the spirit of the crime, the underlying logic, is undeniable. It was a system that deliberately and calculatedly inflicted conditions on a population that led directly to their mass destruction for the profit of an outside group. If that is not, at its core, a genocidal logic, then the word has no meaning. In the final analysis, what was the East India Company? It is a question that defies easy categorization. It was not a state, yet it commanded armies, waged wars, signed treaties, and collected taxes from millions. It was not merely a business, yet its ultimate legally binding purpose was to generate profit for a small group of private investors in a city thousands of miles away. The entity that presided over the Bengal famine was something new in human history, a monstrous hybrid for which we barely have a name. It was the prototype of the corporate raider state. A traditional state, even a ruthless tyranny, is bound by a certain logic. It must, for its own survival, maintain a degree of stability. It needs its population to be productive enough to tax and healthy enough to conscript. The state and the population are locked in a grim, symbiotic relationship. The East India Company, however, severed this link. It pioneered a new form of power that combined the sovereignty of a state with the moral and legal obligations of only a corporation. Its sole fiduciary duty was to its shareholders. The welfare of its subjects in Bengal was, in the cold language of the balance sheet, an externality. Human life was a variable cost to be minimized. This is the central innovation of the corporate raider state, the subordination of all functions of governance to a single metric of profitability. Justice, security, infrastructure, and human survival itself were not seen as ends in themselves, but as potential drains on revenue. The company's rule was a grand, terrifying experiment in answering the question, what happens if you run a country exactly like a ruthless, profit-maximizing business? The answer was the Bengal famine. The company didn't just plunder Bengal, it asset stripped it. It was the ultimate hostile takeover, where the asset being stripped was an entire civilization. In its methods, the company was a dark pioneer of many of the most controversial practices of modern capitalism. Its use of bribery and conspiracy to orchestrate the Battle of Plassey was a masterclass in corporate espionage. The way it used its political power to crush local competition was a textbook example of anti-competitive monopolistic practice. The dual government was a brilliant labyrinthine structure of outsourcing and plausible deniability that would be the envy of any modern CEO trying to distance themselves from the actions of a subcontractor. And the nabobs, with their immense fortunes, returned to Britain to create the first and most powerful corporate lobby in history, bending the will of Parliament to serve their financial interests. The ghost of this entity, its core operating philosophy, is still with us. Its DNA can be found in the darkest corners of our modern globalized world. When you hear a cynical CEO of a multinational corporation speaking off the record, you can sometimes hear a faint echo of Clive. Uncomfortable. Quote, "The activists and the NGOs talk about corporate social responsibility in the developing world. It's a fantasy. We're not there to build their infrastructure for them. The East India Company understood the game 250 years ago. They were the original emerging market specialists. You secure the territory, you control the labor, you eliminate the competition, you repatriate the profits. They didn't get bogged down in sentimental nonsense about the welfare of their stakeholders. They understood who they worked for, their shareholders. They wrote the playbook. We've just added a better legal team and a much slicker PR department. The parallels are inescapable. The power of modern multinational corporations to influence and at times dictate the laws of sovereign nations. The race to the bottom as countries are forced to slash environmental and labor protections to attract corporate investment. The ideology of shareholder primacy, which holds that a corporation's only social responsibility is to increase its profits. All of these are the direct ideological descendants of the East India Company's worldview. The company demonstrated, on a grand and horrific scale, that a for-profit entity, if left unchecked, could grow powerful enough to subordinate human life itself to its balance sheet. It is not a relic of a bygone era. It was a prophecy. It was the birth of a new kind of power, one that operates beyond the traditional constraints of morality or geography. It is the power of abstract capital, accountable to nothing but its own growth. We live today in a world populated by the company's children, corporate entities whose power rivals and sometimes exceeds that of nation-states. The story of the Bengal famine is not just a piece of history. It is a permanent and vital warning about what happens when the logic of the market is allowed to become the logic of life itself. We have reached the end of the paper trail. We have followed the river of silver from the skeletal hands of a Bengali peasant to the dividend checks of a London shareholder. We have traced the blueprint of an atrocity and watched as it was copied and reused across a century. And so we are left with the final, unavoidable calculation: the accounting of the debt. It is a debt of blood and treasure, a debt that has been left unpaid and unacknowledged for 250 years. It is the foundational debt upon which much of the modern world was built, a truth that official history, in its quiet and persistent way, has tried very hard to make us forget. The wealth siphoned out of Bengal in the decades following the Battle of Plassey, and accelerated to a torrential pace by the famine, was not a trivial sum. It was not a footnote in the economic history of Britain. It was the seed capital for global domination. This sudden, massive, and unearned injection of wealth into the British economy was the fuel for the Industrial Revolution. It funded the factories of Manchester, the shipyards of Liverpool, and the banks of London, the country manors of the returning nabobs, the grand new wings of the museums, the very stones of the institutions that are today held up as the pinnacles of Western civilization, are soaked in the invisible blood of the Bengal famine. The prosperity of one small island was purchased with the destruction of what was once the paradise of nations. This is the central, uncomfortable reality. The yawning gap between the developed and the developing world, the chasm of inequality that defines our modern existence, is not an accident. It is not the result of some inherent cultural virtue or geographic destiny. It is the product of a history of systematic and violent transfer. Events like the Great Bengal Famine were not a bug in the system of empire. They were the system's primary function. It was a system designed to underdevelop one part of the world in order to overdevelop another. And what of the debt? It is a debt of acknowledgement, a debt of truth. It is the admission that the stories we have been told are incomplete, that the sanitized narrative of benevolent empire is a fiction written by the victors to soothe their own conscience. The true history is one of a corporate raider state that pioneered a new and terrifying model of power, a model that treated millions of human beings as a disposable resource on the path to profit. The final bitter truth is that we are all still living in the world that the East India Company made. A retired Governor General, in his final unpublished memoirs, might have reflected on this with a clarity that only comes at the end of a long life of ruthless service. Uncomfortable. Quote, "In my final years, I am often asked by young men if I carry regrets from my time in the East. They speak of the famines, the wars, the necessary severities. They fail to grasp the grand calculus of history. We were not in the business of sentiment. We were in the business of building a nation. Our nation. History, you see, is a ledger, not a poem. And on that ledger, the accounts are perfectly clear. We transferred the accumulated wealth of a subcontinent into the treasury of a small island. We used that capital to build our fleets, our factories, and our banks. In short, we built the modern world. The cost was undeniably high, but the cost was paid by them, and the profit was, and continues to be, enjoyed by us. That is the only definition of a successful transaction that has ever mattered in the history of great empires. The profit was enjoyed by us. The cost was paid by them. That is the unpaid debt. It is a debt written in the foundational code of our global economy, in the persistent structures of inequality, and in the deliberate, convenient amnesia that allows the beneficiaries of this history to forget its true price. The most uncomfortable reality is that the story never really ended. The ghosts of Bengal are all around us. We just have to have the courage to see them. The story of the Bengal famine is not a simple one of drought and starvation. It is a story about the creation of a new kind of power, a corporate power that could subordinate a nation and treat human life as an externality on a balance sheet. The consequences of this experiment did not end in 1770. They echoed through the centuries of British rule, creating a blueprint for extraction that impoverished India and enriched Britain, a process that fundamentally shaped the world we all live in today. We've presented a narrative here, synthesizing historical facts to reveal the underlying, uncomfortable truths of these events. The official histories written by the victors rarely tell the whole story. The reality is that the systems of power that created such immense suffering were not accidental. They were the result of deliberate choices made by men in boardrooms and council chambers for the primary purpose of profit and power. The most important lesson is that history is never just in the past. Its consequences are all around us. We encourage you to look deeper into this, to read the sources, and to share your own research and thoughts in the comments below. The more we challenge the comfortable narratives, the closer we get to the truth. And that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.